There are invisible boundaries that separate the human and wild worlds, lines demarcated by millennia of evolution and survival. Never interfere. That's the first commandment for those who inhabit Earth's most remote regions, a principle as fundamental as the law of gravity itself. But what happens when these boundaries are challenged by an instinct even more primitive than self-preservation? Compassion. When the instinct to protect life, any life, overcomes the cold calculation of survival. In the depths of Alaska, where winter is not just a season, but a relentless predator lying in wait, Jack Frost had learned to live by the numbers. How many days his supplies would last, at what temperature skin freezes in seconds, what safe distance to maintain from a grizzly bear. 5 years of voluntary isolation had transformed this former wildlife photographer into a man of precise calculations and frozen emotions, as meticulous in his risk management as nature is indifferent to individual fate. His investment in solitude had been his insurance policy against more pain after losing his wife. But there are storms that defy all predictions, that transform the most solid certainties into desperate gambles. When a bear family, a mother and 2 cubs on the verge of death, appears at his door during the worst blizzard in half a century, Jack finds himself facing an impossible choice. Maintain the safety of his calculated routine or risk everything to save creatures that, on any other day, would be his natural predators. What he couldn't predict was that this impulsive decision, this moment of rediscovered humanity, would trigger an extraordinary series of events that would challenge everything he believed he knew about the natural world. For in the vast and merciless solitude of Alaska, where death is just another climatic phenomenon, an act of compassion was about to reveal a surprising truth. Perhaps the line separating humanity and wilderness is thinner and more permeable than we ever imagined. Jack Frost woke up every morning before the sun, in a ritual he had perfected after 5 solitary winters in Alaska. The wooden cabin, which he had built with his own calloused hands, represented not just shelter, but the most significant investment he had made after his wife's death. The thick walls preserved not only the heat necessary to survive extreme temperatures, but also the memories of the days when he photographed wildlife with an unwavering passion before the pain of loss pushed him into this self-imposed exile. The resilience Jack demonstrated in the face of brutal conditions would impress any survival expert. His daily routine was calculated with Swiss clock precision, checking traps, chopping wood, melting snow for drinking water, all while keeping a vigilant eye on the constantly changing horizon. The value he attributed to his independence was inestimable, even though sometimes the solitude weighed as heavily as the tons of snow accumulated on the cabin roof. At night, he examined his old photographs of bears, wolves, and moose, his only connection to the life he had abandoned. For 5 years, Jack developed a risk management strategy as rigorous as it was intuitive. He knew every sign of nature. Like a banker knows market fluctuations, he could tell when a storm was approaching by the behavior of birds, when ice would be too thin to support his weight, when predators would be hungrier and more dangerous. His decision-making was always guided by caution, especially when it came to dealing with wild animals. Keep your distance, never interfere. That was the mantra he repeated to himself, never imagining that he would soon be forced to break his own most fundamental rule, risking everything he had built in the frozen solitude of Alaska. Jack's weather radio crackled with unsettling static that morning, announcing the worst storm in 50 years approaching the region. The temperature, already naturally hostile, promised to plummet to an impossible level of 45 degrees C, a risk that even the most experienced men of Alaska could not underestimate. As the sky prematurely darkened, Jack redoubled his asset protection strategy, firmly securing the external generator, reinforcing windows with extra boards, and gathering enough firewood for an entire week, sensing in the air that unique density that only major storms bring. The first impact of the winds made the cabin shudder, as if it were alive, emitting wooden groans that sounded almost human. Jack checked his supplies 3 times, mentally calculating his liquidity in terms of resources. Canned food, kerosene for the heater, medicines, each item meticulously inventoried like a prudent accountant would. The sustainability of these resources could be the fine line between life and death in the coming days. Through the small window, he observed the pine trees bending at impossible angles, while the snow no longer fell but flew horizontally in furious gusts that erased any trace of the familiar landscape. At midnight, when the howling wind reached a startling crescendo, Jack realized this was not just another storm. It was a climatic monster, a rare event that would test the limits of the crisis management skills he had learned over the years. The external thermometer broke when the mercury froze. At the height of the storm, even the air seemed to crystallize with each breath. In his years of voluntary isolation, Jack had developed a deep confidence in his ability to face nature's extremes. But something about this particular storm awakened a disturbing sensation in him, as if fate were about to knock at his door, bringing a challenge that wasn't in his survival calculations. The dawn of the second day of the storm brought a brief pause in the winds, as if nature were catching its breath before delivering another blow. It was in this deceptive calm that Jack heard something, a sound almost imperceptible beneath, the constant whisper of snow, but one his trained ears immediately recognized. A low growl followed by a sharp cry, more like a lament than a threat. Cautiously, he opened a crack in the door and felt his heart freeze faster than the mercury in the thermometer. There, less than 10 meters from the cabin, an enormous grizzly bear struggled to move through the deep snow, its normally exuberant fur now covered by a layer of ice that shimmered like deadly crystals under the diffuse light. Jack's decision-making had always been guided by extreme caution with predators, especially bears, which represented the greatest risk in the region. But what he saw now defied all his survival logic. It wasn't just a bear, but an exhausted mother with 2 small cubs, so undernourished and debilitated that they could barely stand. The meticulous planning of any bear included hibernating during storms like this, but something, perhaps an avalanche or hunters, had clearly interrupted this family's natural cycle. The cubs' gazes, confused and frightened, reflected an innocence Jack hadn't seen since he photographed his last bear litter years ago. The bear staggered, falling heavily into the snow and breathing with visible difficulty. One of the cubs tried to push her with its snout, emitting small sounds of distress that cut through Jack like an icy blade. Instinctively, his brain calculated the risk management options. An adult grizzly bear can kill a man with a single swipe of its paw, even when debilitated. But his heart, that organ he believed had hardened like the ice surrounding him, began to melt at the scene. The bear looked directly at him, not with typical territorial aggression, but with something that seemed impossibly like a silent plea. In that moment, Jack understood that his next decision could be the greatest investment of his life, or his last mistake. Never interfere with wildlife. This rule had been etched into Jack's mind by his mentors, survival books, and personal experience. Interfering meant unbalancing the delicate natural equilibrium and frequently resulted in tragedy for both humans and animals. But as he watched the bear family struggling against certain death by freezing, Jack felt an internal revolution against his own doctrine of self-preservation. The value of life, even non-human life, began to weigh more in his moral balance than the safety protocols he had always followed with military rigor. With the storm winds beginning to howl again, he knew he had only minutes for a decision-making process that would challenge everything he had learned. "I'm a fool," he muttered to himself as he quickly put on all the layers of thermal clothing he owned. Risk management would advise staying inside the cabin, letting nature follow its merciless course. But something deeper drove him. Perhaps solitude had reconfigured his notion of reciprocity with the natural world. Or perhaps it was simply the almost human expression in the mother bear's eyes. Behind the main cabin, Jack maintained a small wooden storage shed for equipment, insulated and equipped with an old kerosene heater rarely used, an investment in redundancy that now seemed providential. His mind calculated feverishly as he unlocked the shed door. How much kerosene to heat the space? For how long? The risk of a bear recovering inside his property? The cutting wind lashed at his face as he moved with difficulty through the deep snow, cautiously approaching the bear. He was violating the basic manual of asset protection, his own life, by approaching an apex predator, especially a female, with cubs. But the bear barely managed to raise her head when he arrived just a few meters away, an alarming sign of her extreme weakness. The cubs, however, bristled their fur in childish attempts to appear intimidating. Jack spoke softly, in a constant tone he used with wild animals during his photographic expeditions. "I know, you don't trust me. I wouldn't trust me either." As he prepared the shed, turning on the heater and adjusting the temperature with hands, trembling from adrenaline, Jack knew he was at a point of no return. His resilience would now be tested not only against the fury of the climate, but against his own fundamental rules of survival. Jack returned to the shed carrying old blankets and a bucket with warm water mixed with honey and protein powder, an improvised mixture he hoped would provide quick energy. His body trembled not only from the cutting cold, but from the pure tension of what he was about to attempt. Each step in the deep snow was an exercise in risk management recalculated in real time. The bear remained in the same spot, now more covered with snow, her movements increasingly weak. The cubs, perhaps understanding the gravity of the situation, had stopped their childish attempts at intimidation and now only huddled against their mother's massive body, seeking warmth she could barely produce. Jack knew that the liquidity of his time, the most valuable resource at that moment, was rapidly running out for everyone involved. "Please don't kill me," Jack muttered, approaching with slow and deliberate movements. Theory said that grizzly bears can detect fear by smell, so he tried to control his breathing and project a calmness he was far from feeling. The bear's eyes, deep amber with patches of exhaustion, followed his every movement with a mixture of distrust and hopelessness. With meticulous care, Jack spread the blankets on the ground, creating a path from where the bear was to the door of the shed, now heated and prepared as a temporary refuge. It was an absurd investment of resources in a situation with uncertain returns, but he continued methodically, speaking in a low and constant voice. "I know it's difficult, but I need you to come with me. You won't survive out here." The water with honey and protein was placed near the bear's snout, which after a moment of hesitation, began to drink eagerly. That first gesture of trust, the bear accepting food from his hands, made something strange happen inside Jack's chest, an emotion he hadn't identified in years, perhaps something close to hope. He stepped back a few paces and waited, knowing that any attempt to force the situation would result in failure or worse. Crisis management now required patience, allowing the animal to make its own decision. Minutes passed with the torturous slowness of hours as the storm began to gain strength again. The bear, after finishing the mixture, licked her snout and made an attempt to stand, faltering in the first 2 tries. On the third effort, she managed to get on all 4 paws, though visibly unstable. With a head movement, she called the cubs, who promptly positioned themselves under her, seeking protection. Jack held his breath as the family took the first, hesitant step toward the blankets leading to the shed, a decision that represented the delicate line between the sustainability of life and surrender to the merciless elements. The blankets spread out seemed like a fragile path between 2 worlds, the wild world governed by the relentless laws of survival, and the small space of artificial warmth that Jack had created. Each step the bear took was an exercise in pure willpower, her enormous paws visibly trembling as she advanced along the improvised path. The cubs followed her faithfully, occasionally emitting sharp sounds of discomfort when the cutting wind hit them. Jack kept his distance, his body tense, like a violin string, aware that any sudden movement could destroy the tenuous trust that was establishing itself. The storm intensified again, transforming the air into ice needles that pierced any exposed skin, a cruel reminder of the importance of this risky investment he was making in preserving this unlikely family. When the bear finally reached the entrance to the shed, she hesitated. The heat emanating from inside contrasted drastically with the frozen air, and the confined space represented an obvious risk for a wild animal. Jack held his breath, all his effort, All violation of the basic rules of asset protection depended on this critical moment of decision-making. The bear sniffed the heated air, her eyes fixed on Jack with a disconcerting intensity. One of the cubs, apparently weaker than its sibling, stumbled and fell in the snow with a sharp whimper. It was, this small sound of suffering that seemed to finally decide the mother. With one last look at Jack, which he would later swear contained a mixture of desperation and gratitude, the bear guided her cubs into the heated shed, her gigantic form filling almost all the available space. Jack approached with extreme caution to partially close the door, leaving just a crack for ventilation, as the bear settled in a corner, with the cubs immediately seeking her protection. The moment was surreal. The image of an apex predator voluntarily using a human space as refuge defied all probabilities and knowledge about animal behavior. As he adjusted the heater temperature to maintain a constant and comfortable environment, Jack reflected on the strange reciprocity of that arrangement. The bear had placed her family's life in the hands of a potential predator, a decision-making process based purely on survival instinct. Outside, the storm roared with renewed violence, but inside that small refuge, a silent truce had been established between species that would normally avoid each other at all costs. As he closed the main cabin door behind him, Jack couldn't help but ponder the return of this risky rescue operation, not in material terms, but as an investment in something he had lost in his years of isolation, his own humanity. The storm raged for another 36 hours, transforming the outside world into a frozen nightmare scenario. But inside the small shed, a silent battle for life was being waged. Every 3 hours, Jack prepared himself as if entering a war zone. Multiple layers of clothing, thick gloves, and a mask covering almost his entire face. Not only to protect himself from the cold, but to appear less human, less threatening. He always carried the same metal bucket with the nutritious mixture he had improvised, a planning process that required almost scientific precision. How much food would be sufficient without causing digestive problems? How to balance nutrients for efficient recovery? It was like calculating a complex investment portfolio, where each decision had immediate and visible consequences. On his first visit after installing them, Jack found the bear still profoundly exhausted, barely able to raise her head when he entered. The cubs, however, already showed signs of recovery, the incredible resilience of the young, observing him with attentive eyes but without aggression. The constant heat from the heater had melted the ice in their fur, revealing patches of irritated skin that Jack cautiously treated with an antibiotic ointment from his personal stock. The diversification of his medical supplies, a precaution he had always maintained for human emergencies, now proved its value in a completely unexpected context. After the second day, the bear managed to sit up and consume larger portions of food, her paws still trembling, but her eyes more alert, following Jack's every movement with an almost intelligent curiosity that disconcerted him. The third day brought a remarkable transformation. The bear stood up completely when Jack entered, not in an aggressive posture, but in recognition. The cubs, now occasionally playing with each other, an unmistakable sign of recovery, immediately stopped and sought protection behind their mother. But there was something different in the dynamic, a tacit trust that had been established. Jack constantly spoke in a low and calm voice, explaining each movement before making it, as if the bear could understand his words. "I'm just changing the water, I won't come any closer." Or, "I need to check the heater, I'll stay away from you." In his emotional liquidity, something had fundamentally changed, the solitude of 5 years giving way to an unlikely connection with these survivors. The radio reported that the storm would soon abate, and Jack felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The crisis management had been successful, but the return to normality would mean the separation of this strange bond, as brief as it was profound, which had redefined his understanding of the value of life beyond his own needs. The storm finally subsided on the morning of the 4th day, leaving behind a transformed world, a completely white and silent landscape, as if nature was too exhausted for any sound. The first rays of sunlight in days created sparkling crystals on the fresh snow, a spectacle of beauty that contrasted drastically with the fury of the previous days. Jack watched through the cabin window, feeling the weight of the decision-making process that approached. The weather radio predicted temperatures gradually rising in the coming days, making the forest habitable again for its original inhabitants. The mixture of relief and anticipation of loss created a strange sensation in his chest, like an investor who knows he must divest from a valuable asset at the right moment, despite the emotional attachment he has developed. The last visit to the shed was different. When Jack opened the door, he found the bear completely awake and alert, her already dominant posture indicating the near-complete recovery of her strength. The cubs, now playing energetically with each other, seemed unrecognizable compared to the moribund creatures of 3 days ago, an impressive return thanks to the heat, food, and temporary safety. Jack maintained a respectful distance, aware that the balance of power was rapidly changing. The resilience of wild animals had always surprised him, but seeing this transformation firsthand was something completely different. "I think it's time," he said softly, more to himself than to the bears. With deliberate movements, he fully opened the shed door, creating a direct path to freedom, and retreated several meters, purposely placing himself out of sight. For almost an hour, nothing happened. The risk of going out into the unknown, even with the storm dissipated, required careful evaluation. Jack waited patiently, as he had learned to do in his years photographing wildlife. Finally, the bear appeared at the entrance, her massive body blocking the entire opening, her snout cautiously testing the air. The cubs compressed behind her, still hesitant. With an almost imperceptible head movement, the bear called the cubs to follow her and took her first steps outside, her paws sinking into the deep snow. Jack observed from a distance, through the cabin window, feeling a mixture of pride and melancholy that he hadn't experienced since his days as a photographer, when he captured perfect moments in nature. The family moved slowly through the snow, the bear occasionally stopping to inspect the path ahead, guiding her cubs back to the forest that was their true home. But before disappearing among the snow-laden trees, the bear stopped and turned, looking directly in Jack's direction, as if she could see him through the cabin walls. It was a brief look, but loaded with something that defied explanation. A recognition, perhaps, that some boundaries, even the most fundamental ones, can be temporarily dissolved in the name of the sustainability of life. 3 months passed, transforming the white world into a vibrant awakening of green. Spring finally imposing its vitality, even in this inhospitable region. Jack, who rarely traveled to town, felt an inexplicable need to replenish supplies, although his liquidity in terms of resources was still sufficient for weeks. Perhaps it was simply the call of spring, that renewed energy that seemed to infect all living creatures. His old Jeep Ranger moved slowly along the narrow and winding road that cut through the forest, the only path connecting his isolated cabin to the nearest village. The decision-making to make this trip had been almost impulsive, unusual behavior for a man who meticulously calculated every aspect of his existence since he had chosen solitude as his companion. A sudden movement ahead made Jack hit the brakes abruptly. There, just 15 meters away, a large and familiar form completely blocked the narrow path. The grizzly bear he had sheltered was standing in the middle of the road, her 2 cubs, now visibly larger and stronger, playing near her. Jack's heart instantly accelerated, a mixture of surprise, admiration, and apprehension. The risk of the situation was evident. Road encounters with bears rarely ended well, especially with cubs nearby. All his experience screamed for him to stay in the vehicle, maintain distance, honk the horn to scare them away. But something in the bear's behavior intrigued him. She showed neither surprise nor aggression. On the contrary, she seemed to be deliberately standing there, her eyes fixed directly on his with a disturbing intensity, as if she had expected him. Long seconds passed in this strange impasse. Jack turned off the engine, amplifying the silence of the surrounding forest. His brain tried to process the probabilities of this encounter being mere coincidence. The diversification of grizzly bear territories in the region made it statistically unlikely that it was the same family. Still, there was something undeniably familiar in the bear's posture, in the way she slightly tilted her head while watching him. Suddenly, in a movement that paralyzed Jack with astonishment, the bear growled deeply and stamped her paw on the ground, making the cubs immediately run to the protection of the trees at the roadside. She looked one last time at Jack, intensely, almost pleadingly, before following her cubs off the road. Confused, Jack waited a few minutes before starting the engine again, wondering what kind of animal behavior he had just witnessed. It was at that exact moment, when his foot touched the accelerator, that the deafening sound came, a deep and violent rumble that seemed to shake the very structure of the mountain above. Before he could fully process what was happening, he saw through the rearview mirror gigantic rocks and uprooted trees descending in an avalanche, exactly where his car would have been if he had continued driving. Jack remained immobilized inside the vehicle, his body pierced by alternating waves of adrenaline and comprehension. The landslide had ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind an impenetrable barrier of rocks and trees that completely blocked the road where, seconds before, he would have been driving. His analytical mind, accustomed to calculating risk and probability, struggled to accept the undeniable evidence before his eyes. The bears, especially the mother, had deliberately prevented his advance, keeping him exactly at the only safe point on the road. The synchronicity was too precise to be coincidence. A shiver ran down his spine, not from fear, but from a kind of reverence. With hands still trembling, Jack slowly got out of the Jeep. The trail of destruction extended for about 100 meters. Massive stones and twisted trunks forming a barricade that would take days for local authorities to remove. If he had continued driving, the thought was too clear in its consequences. The risk management that had guided his entire isolated existence had been momentarily assumed by an external force, an asset protection not by human systems, but by an apex predator that, for some impossible reason, had decided to repay the help received months before. In his years as a wildlife photographer, and in all the scientific literature he had studied, he had never found documentation of similar behavior. The boundaries between animal instinct and something deeper, more conscious, suddenly seemed nebulous. In the distance, at the edge of the forest, Jack glimpsed what he believed to be the silhouette of the bear, a dark form partially visible among the trees, watching. Without thinking twice, he did something that contradicted all his training. He slightly inclined his body in a gesture that could only be interpreted as a bow, a silent thank you. The form remained motionless for a few seconds before completely disappearing into the density of the forest. On the way back to the cabin, forced to return due to the blocked road, Jack felt something transform inside him, a return to a long-forgotten sensation. The pain of loss that had pushed him into isolation seemed, for the first time in 5 years, to give way to a deep appreciation for the reciprocity of life. His impulsive investment in saving that family during the storm had generated an inestimable return, his own life preserved. But beyond that, he had received something more valuable, the understanding that even in the most remote places and under the most extreme circumstances, trust and gratitude could flourish in the most unexpected forms, transcending the boundaries between species. That night, in his silent cabin, Jack took his dusty old camera from the closet and placed it on the table. Perhaps it was time to reconnect with the world, to recalibrate the value of his existence. After all, he was now living proof that even in the wild, apparently governed only by the law of the strongest, there was room for the most human of virtues, the memory of goodness received, and the impulse to return it. There are stories that will never be recorded in scientific books or official reports. Moments of connection so extraordinary between humans and wild animals that they defy our limited understanding of the natural world. Jack Frost's journey, from an isolated man who meticulously calculated every aspect of his existence to keep himself safe, to someone who rediscovered the incalculable value of compassion, represents more than a simple survival narrative. In a world increasingly dominated by risk analysis, return on investments, and asset protection, we often forget that there are emotional dividends that no spreadsheet can capture. What Jack received, not only his life saved by an unlikely act of animal reciprocity, but the healing of a heart that had hardened as much as the glaciers surrounding him, transcends any conventional measure of value. The bear, guided by instincts that our science is still crawling to understand, not only survived thanks to human intervention, but returned the gesture in a way that definitively transformed Jack's perception of the natural world. Perhaps the true miracle of this story isn't that wild animals can show behaviors we interpret as gratitude, but that we humans, with all our complexity and rationality, are still capable of risking everything for an impulse as basic as the will to preserve life, any life. This willingness to transcend the boundaries of self-preservation, to find value beyond calculation, is what truly connects us to the most fundamental fabric of nature. When Jack finally dusted off his old camera that night, he wasn't just resuming an abandoned hobby. He was declaring his willingness to reconnect with the world, to see beauty and meaning again where before he saw only isolation and survival. The sustainability of life, he discovered, doesn't depend only on carefully managed resources, but also on unexpected connections, on moments of trust that defy all logic, on emotional investments without guarantees. And you? What extraordinary stories of connection with the animal world have marked your life? What transformative moments have you experienced by extending a hand beyond your comfort zone, risking something precious for an impulse of compassion? For perhaps, like Jack, you too have experienced that revealing instant when the boundaries between human and animal, between civilization and nature, momentarily dissolve. And in that brief interval of clarity, we glimpse an ancestral truth: that all forms of life are connected by invisible threads of reciprocity, older than our differences and more enduring than our fears.